The universe does not favor the quiet. It does not reward the silent, nor does it spare the meek. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the intergalactic void, silence is merely a prelude to consumption. The Kael'Thasi knew this. They were an ancient species, older than the stars that warmed the cradle of Earth, and they had learned the cruelest lesson of existence early in their history. Anything that speaks into the darkness eventually gets an answer it does not want. So the Kael'Thasi stopped speaking. They stopped exploring. They stopped expanding. Instead, they built. They constructed the sanctuary of Ethelgard. It was not a planet nor a station, but a construct of such immense proportions that it registered as a gravitational anomaly to distant observers. A Dyson swarm of overlapping, hyperdense crystalline plates, layered in dimensions that folded space back upon itself. It was a shelter designed to withstand the entropy of the universe, a fortress of absolute isolation. Inside, 1 trillion souls lived in a simulated paradise, bathed in the artificial light of a trapped star, unaware of the cold death hunting through the galaxies outside. They believed that if they remained still enough, the great predators of the cosmos, the scouring swarms of the void hunters, would pass them by. For 10,000 years they were right, and then humanity arrived. We did not come quietly. We did not come with the grace of an ancient elder race, or the subtlety of those who wished to remain unseen. We came bleeding, burning, and screaming defiance across the subspace bands. The Terran 7th Fleet, or what was left of it, dropped out of warp space right on the edge of the Ethelgard sensory perimeter. Our engines were running hot reactor cores, leaking radiation into the pristine vacuum, hulls scarred by plasma burns and kinetic impacts. We were the loud neighbors crashing a funeral. The Kael'Thasi High Council was horrified. Their sensors, tuned for the slightest whisper of danger, were suddenly deafened by the electromagnetic roar of 300 Terran dreadnoughts, venting coolant and broadcasting distress signals on every frequency known to physics. High Counselor Xylos watched the main viewscreen in the command spire, his 4 slender hands gripping the railing in sheer panic. The terrified murmurs of his tactical officers filled the room. They had never seen war. They had only studied it as a historical abstract, a disease of lesser species. Now it was on their doorstep. The humans were requesting entry, begging for it. They claimed they were the last remnants of a civilization pursued by the Void Hunters, the very nightmare the Kael'Thasi had built this shelter to avoid. The debate in the council was short. If they left the humans outside, the noise of their destruction would draw the Void Hunters to the sanctuary's location. If they let them in, they risked contamination by a violent, primitive species. But Xylos, in a moment of pity that he would later come to question, authorized the breach. The massive crystalline petals of the sanctuary opened, just enough to let the burning Terran ships limp inside the protective shell. The humans landed their behemoths on the outer docking rings, the metal of their ships clashing hideously with the elegant, sunglass architecture of the aliens. Xylos met with the human leader, an admiral named Sarah Vance. She was short by Kael'Thasi standards, lacking the ethereal grace of the elders, but there was a density to her presence. She wore armor that looked like it had been welded together from scrap, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching worlds die. Vance thanked them for the shelter. She promised that her people would remain in the lower quarantine zones, that they would repair their ships and stay quiet. She lied. For the first 6 months, the peace held. The Kael'Thasi watched the humans with a mixture of disgust and fascination. The humans were loud, abrasive, and constantly moving. They didn't meditate. They didn't compose poetry about the silence. They worked. The lower docking rings, once silent halls of storage, became a hive of industrial noise. Sparks flew, hammers rang, and the guttural roar of engine tests vibrated through the crystalline floor. Xylos summoned Vance to the high spire. He demanded an explanation. Why were they not resting? Why were they not grateful for the peace of the sanctuary? Vance looked at the counselor, her face smeared with grease, and said simply, "Because they are still coming." Xylos scoffed. The sanctuary was impenetrable. Its shields were phased out of normal reality. Its hull was thick enough to survive a supernova. Nothing could get in. Vance didn't argue, she just went back to work. But the humans were doing more than repairing. Kael'Thasi engineers, sent to monitor the guests, reported strange anomalies. The humans were stripping their own ships. They were tearing out warp cores, weapons arrays, and shield generators. But they weren't building new ships. They were wiring their technology into the sanctuary itself. They were drilling into the sacred crystalline lattice, running thick, ugly cables of copper and conduit into the elegant energy grid of the alien station. When Xylos found out he was apoplectic, he ordered the humans to cease immediately. He threatened to eject them back into the void. Vance stood her ground. She told him that the sanctuary was not a fortress, it was a coffin. She told him that hiding only works until the enemy learns how to dig. And the Void Hunters, the ancient enemy that had scoured the galaxy of life, were excellent diggers. The argument was cut short by the siren. It was a sound the Kael'Thasi had never heard in reality, only in simulations. The proximity alarm. The outer sensors, drifting light years away in the deep dark, had gone silent. Then the next ring of sensors. Then the next. The darkness was approaching, and it was hungry. The Void Hunters had found them. Panic, absolute and total, swept through the sanctuary. The Kael'Thasi populace, a trillion souls raised in the belief of absolute safety, dissolved into chaos. They had no weapons. They had no soldiers. They had only the wall. Xylos stood in the command spire, watching the holographic display as the red tide of the enemy swarm washed over the system. They were biological ships, massive leviathans of flesh and bone that fed on energy. They didn't fire lasers. They latched onto shields and drained them dry. They burrowed into hulls and injected viral troops. They were the entropy of the universe given teeth. "Activate the phase shields," Xylos screamed, his voice cracking. The tactical officer, weeping openly, pressed the controls. The great crystalline plates of the sanctuary hummed, shifting their vibrational frequency to step out of sync with reality. It was the ultimate defense. Nothing in the material universe could touch them. The swarm hit the shield, and they began to eat it. Xylos watched in horror as the energy readings plummeted. The Void Hunters were not merely brute force, they were adaptive. They had encountered phase technology before, perhaps eons ago, and they remembered the taste. They adjusted their own biological resonance, matching the shield's frequency, and bit down. The sanctuary shook. A trillion screams echoed through the psychic link of the Kael'Thasi. "It's over," the tactical officer whispered. "The great silence has come for us." Xylos fell to his knees. The arrogance of 10,000 years evaporated, leaving only the terrified child beneath. They had hidden for so long they had forgotten how to survive. And then the door to the command spire hissed open. Admiral Vance walked in. She was not alone. Behind her were a dozen Terran Marines, fully armored, carrying weapons that looked like industrial mining equipment modified for murder. But Vance wasn't looking at Xylos. She was looking at the main console. "Get up," she said, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "There is no point," Xylos wept. "The shields are failing. We are undone." "Your shields are failing because you're using them as a wall," Vance snapped. She shoved the weeping tactical officer aside and began typing commands into the console. The interface was alien, elegant, designed for soft touches and complex harmonics. Vance slammed her gloved fingers onto the keys with brutal efficiency. "You built a dam to hold back the ocean, Counselor. But you forgot that dams have spillways. You forgot that pressure can be redirected." "What are you doing?" Xylos cried out as the lights in the spire flickered and turned a harsh, warning red. "I'm ending the quarantine," Vance growled. On the tactical map, the icons representing the Terran sector of the station, the lower docking rings, suddenly flared with energy. The power output was impossible. It dwarfed the output of the station's main reactor. "You authorized the repairs," Vance said, not looking up. "But we didn't repair our ships. We scrapped them. We took 300 warp cores, 5,000 fusion reactors, and every railgun battery we had, and we integrated them into your grid. We turned the lower rings into a capacitor." That is impossible," Xylos stammered. "The grid cannot handle that surge. It will destroy the sanctuary." "Only if we keep it inside," Vance said. She looked at Xylos, and for the first time the alien saw the true nature of humanity. It wasn't the violence or the noise or the dirt. It was the refusal, the absolute biological inability to accept the end. "We aren't hiding anymore, Counselor. Open the iris." "The iris? The main hangar bay doors, open them," Vance roared. Xylos, compelled by a force of will he could not comprehend, nodded to his subordinates. They entered the commands. On the surface of the Dyson sphere, a massive section of the crystalline armor began to retract. It exposed the soft underbelly of the station to the void, to the swarming millions of void hunters. The enemy sensed the opening. Like a school of piranhas sensing blood, they turned from the shields and surged toward the open hangar, screeching across the electromagnetic spectrum. They poured into the opening, a river of teeth and claws, ready to consume the soft flesh within. "They are entering," the tactical officer screamed. "Millions of them, we are lost." Vance watched the screen. She watched the red dots flood into the kill zone. She waited. Her hand hovered over a large, crude mechanical lever that had been jury-rigged onto the sleek alien console. It was a manual override, welded directly into the station's firing circuits. "Wait for it," she whispered. The swarm filled the massive hangar bay, a space the size of a continent. They were so dense they blocked out the artificial sun. They thought they had found the meat. "Now," Vance said. She pulled the lever. The humans hadn't just built a capacitor. They had built a claymore mine the size of a moon. The energy stored in the 300 cannibalized warp cores, amplified by the Sanctuary's own massive stellar grid, was not released as a shield. It was released as a raw, directed pulse of kinetic and thermal violence. The lower docking rings didn't just fire, they detonated. But the explosion was shaped. The humans had reinforced the walls of the hangar with gravity plating, creating a cannon barrel thousands of miles long. The blast had nowhere to go but out. A pillar of white fire, hotter than the surface of the star trapped within the sphere, erupted from the open iris. It was a spear of pure destruction, a lance of god fire that vaporized everything in its path. The millions of void hunters inside the hangar didn't die. They ceased to exist. They were atomized instantly, their biological matter converted into plasma that only added to the velocity of the blast. The beam punched out of the station, screaming into the void. It caught the main body of the void hunter swarm, which was massing outside the breach. The beam cleaved the swarm in half. Leviathans the size of cities were incinerated. The shockwave of the energy discharge shattered the carapace of the enemy fleet for 1,000,000 miles. The silence of space was shattered by the sheer radiometric volume of the event. Inside the command spire, the floor shook violently enough to knock Xylos off his feet. The lights died, replaced by the emergency amber glow of Terran tech. Silence returned to the room. Vance stood panting, her hand still gripping the lever. "Report," she barked. A human technician seated at a secondary console responded. "Main capacitor drained, emitters fused. We blew out the primary relays on decks 40 through 400. Structural integrity is at 60%. And the enemy? The central mass is gone, Admiral, vaporized. The remnants are scattering. They're retreating. They've never seen prey bite back this hard." Xylos slowly pulled himself up. He looked at the screen. The red tide was gone. A scar of cooling plasma drifted in the void, marking the grave of the invincible swarm. You turned the Sanctuary into a weapon," Xylos whispered, his mind struggling to process the heresy. "You desecrated the shelter." "We saved your lives," Vance said, turning to face him. "You were hiding in a hole, waiting to die. We turned the hole into a trench." "But the damage." "The harmony is for the dead," Vance interrupted, her voice softening slightly. "Survival is messy, it's loud, it breaks things, but it beats the alternative." The Kael'Thasi looked at the humans, really looked at them. For 10,000 years, they had pitied these short-lived, violent creatures. They had seen them as children playing with fire. But as Xylos looked at the burning readouts, at the impossible victory snatched from the jaws of inevitable death, he realized the truth. The humans were not children, they were the fire. "The swarm will return," Xylos said, the fear creeping back. "They always return. We have angered them now. They will bring more." "Good," Vance said. A grim smile touched her lips. "Let them come." She walked over to the main display, where the schematic of the massive Dyson sphere rotated. She began tapping new coordinates, highlighting sections of the crystalline shell. "We blew the main capacitor, so we can't do that again," Vance mused, more to herself than to him. "But you have 17 gravitational stabilizers on the northern hemisphere. If we reverse the polarity on those, we can turn this station into a kinetic ram." You intend to move the sanctuary? Xylos gasped. It is immovable. It is a fortress. Not anymore, Vance said. Now it's a battleship. And we're taking the fight to them. The following months were a blur of activity that fundamentally changed the nature of the Kael'Thasi society. The caste system, based on meditation and stillness, collapsed under the weight of necessity. The humans took charge, not by conquest, but by competence. They organized work crews, mixing Kael'Thasi matter weavers with Terran grease monkeys. The beautiful, singing crystal of the station was plated over with ugly, durable tritanium. Missile batteries were installed in the meditation gardens. Fighter hangars replaced the reflection pools. The Kael'Thasi, initially horrified, found a strange new sensation waking within them. It was a vibration in their blood, a heat in their chests. It was the adrenaline of agency. For the first time in eons, they were not waiting for the end. They were preparing to dictate the terms of their own existence. Xylos himself found he had a knack for logistics. He worked alongside Admiral Vance, coordinating the supply lines for the new fleet being built from the wreckage of the Void Hunter Leviathans. "You humans," Xylos said one day as they watched a new Terran Kael'Thasi hybrid frigate launch from the dry dock. "You speak of